Hello, everyone. It is 11 o'clock Eastern here, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Connor Carlin, the Vice President of Sustainability on the Society of Plastics Engineers Executive Board, and I will be the webinar moderator today. Before we begin, there's just a few small housekeeping items that I want to explain. So the audio will be muted for everybody except for our presenter. If you have questions or comments, and we encourage questions or comments, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. Do not use the chat function, use the Q&A feature. And we'll address all questions at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And to open the Q&A feature, scroll your mouse to the bottom of the screen and click on the Q&A item. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post both Chris's presentation and the recorded webinar in the SPE library. Now, we're thrilled to have Chris DeArmitt with us here today. He's going to be discussing a seriously hot topic of plastics and the environment, dispelling popular myths with scientific facts. Now, Chris is considered one of the top plastics materials experts and problem solvers in the world, which is why companies like HP, Apple, Exxon, P&G, iRobot, Eaton, Total, and Disney come to him for help. A deep understanding of materials combined with high creativity allows Chris to quickly solve even the toughest challenges. Chris has also received 6 Open Innovation Cash Prizes, placing him amongst the top 0.01% of innovators in the world. In 2016, Chris published Innovation Abyss, an exploration of the true reasons for innovation failure and the proven path to success. He has been featured on CBS's 60 Minutes, Sky News, and the BBC. Chris has been granted many patents and has written numerous articles, books, encyclopedia chapters, and conference presentations. He's an award-winning keynote speaker on plastic materials, the environment, and innovation-related topics. In 2020, he published The Plastics Paradox, the first comprehensive overview of plastics materials and the environment, covering waste, litter, microplastics, degradation, and other important topics. So let's all give a big welcome to Chris DeArmitt today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Connor. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people in the webinar. And let's get started. This is an important topic as it relates to how we're going to leave the planet for future generations. Therefore, it's worth serious study because we need solid data upon which to make sound decisions. What concerns me as a scientist is that people have strong, passionate views in a complete absence of data. They base their reviews on internet gossip with no scientific citations, so we can't tell what's true and what isn't true. My answer was to go and look for the science. The majority of people tend to go and look only for evidence to support their preconceived opinions and stop there. But as a scientist, at least the professional ones, they don't do that. They have to read everything they can find and then only make up their mind based on the evidence once they've read absolutely everything there is there from both sides. It's a lot more work to do it that way, but that's the way I did it. And that's why I had to read about 400 articles to write the book. And I'm talking about peer-reviewed scientific articles here, not gossip pieces. I condensed all of that into a book so everyone can see what I found, and hopefully that will lead to wise policies for the future. I want to mention that I'm a scientist. I'm not a lobbyist. I don't make plastics. I don't sell them, and I don't market them. And I did all of this with no funding whatsoever. Nobody's paying me not a single cent to do this. I know that some people on this call are ardently against my message, even before I've spoken. That's understandable because they've had a decade of misinformation without any pushback. And studies show that if you repeat a lie enough times, people will believe it. A religious fervor has overcome a large group of enthusiastic people. Enthusiasm and virtue can be wonderful, but only when directed wisely. I hope that anyone who truly cares about the environment cares enough to really listen to the science and consider it. Try to blank out everything that you've been told and really listen to the data, because everything I'm going to say is backed by peer-reviewed science. I know that's a very hard task and not many people can do it. It's very, very hard to change your mind and open your mind, but I hope that some of you can. If you're against plastics, quite frankly, I understand why. But ask yourself this: how many peer-reviewed scientific articles have you read? Are you an expert on plastic materials? Most people have never seen the facts until now. I'm going to try and go through and mention, at least touch upon every single chapter in the book, because if you miss any of these topics, you don't really get the complete picture. So you have to touch upon degradation, litter, waste, the environment, what's green, what isn't green, and the motivations behind why we've got so much interesting disinformation in front of us. So let's get cracking. At least we will if I can turn the page. Here we go. So here's an example, right? Americans use about 500 million straws a day. That was repeated by the USA Today, CNN, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and the New York Times. Where did that information come from? It was made up by a 9-year-old schoolboy called Milo Kress. He pulled a number out of the air. He said he made a few phone calls. He kept no record of those phone calls. And he convinced everybody in the whole world that Americans were using 500 million straws a day. That number was wrong in the end, but nobody thought to check it, right? This is sensationalist journalism. People believe what they want to believe, and it sounded dramatic, and everybody picked it up. This is the kind of nonsense that we've been brainwashed with for 10 years. And as a scientist, I find that completely unacceptable, because if we start with nonsense, we're going to make policies based on nonsense, and they're going to be counterproductive. So this is one example, but there's loads more, right? There's going to be more plastic than fish in the sea. That's been debunked. There's tons of other things, and they're all nonsense when you check into them, but nobody is checking. People only care about this sensationalist stuff and the hype because it's exciting. And the truth is maybe less exciting, but it's what we need if we're going to forge a path ahead. Okay, so that's nonsense, and I've got a list of other things which have been proven to be nonsense at the end. So what is green? That's the first question, right? This is how I think about things, right? First find what's green, and then try to use that material as much as possible, and make less waste, recycle it, reuse it, and so on. That's the way that I think is a logical way to approach things. So let's start off with what is green, and let's start with something that everyone knows about: plastic bags. And that's what we're going to talk about first. So here's a life cycle analysis. These are not perfect, but this is the only known and accepted way to tell what's green and what isn't. Governments use it, companies use it, Greenpeace even uses it, right? So this is the only accepted way. It's not perfect, but it adds up all of the materials, all the pollution, all of the transportation. It even includes recycling at the end of life and all of this kind of stuff, right? And this is an ISO standard where everybody has to follow the same rules. They get the data from the same databases and all of this kind of stuff, right? So this is not perfect, but it is accepted, and it's the only tool we have to tell. Otherwise, we might as well just toss a coin, right, and say, hey, my product's greenest because it's mine. This is the only way that we really have. So, and it works. And to be extra sure, it's good to look at more than one life cycle analysis, right? Don't believe any one, because anyone can have a bias. Make sure you look at more than one. So here we go. This is what a life cycle analysis entails, and it's a lot of money, so you won't find it for every product. But let's take a look at plastic bags. I went looking to see, because everyone talked about plastic bags, I went looking to see, had there ever been a life cycle analysis? Here are the lovely plastic bags. And what did I find? I found about 8 or 10. They're all posted on my website, and they're in the book. And every single one concluded that plastic bags were greenest. Every one ever published, right? I'm not cherry picking here. Every one, 8 or 10 of them, they're all listed. You can follow the links. You can read them yourself. And this is quotes word for word from every one. So cotton bags were disastrous. You needed to reuse them 200 or 250 times to break even with a plastic bag. The paper bags were much worse. And so every single study says we should be using plastic bags. So this makes you wonder, right? Why are we having all these bag bans? Have the politicians not seen this? Has Greenpeace not seen it? What is going on? Because you can go into Google right now after the talk and type in LCA plastic bag, or LCA grocery bag, or life cycle analysis grocery bag, and you will get the same hits I did. I even challenged somebody to find one that I hadn't found, and they couldn't, right? A PhD chemist couldn't find any that I hadn't found. Every single one, these are 4 of them, but there are 8 or 10, says that plastics win. So why are we banning plastic bags if they're unequivocally the greenest solution on the planet using the same methods that Greenpeace and governments use? That's a mystery to me. Okay, next slide. So here's an example, right? The guy who invented the plastic bag, he did it to save trees, right? He was concerned. He's a Swedish guy. He took a patent 100 years ago. He wanted to save trees by using plastic instead. If we want to replace a plastic bag with paper, we need 2.7 times more energy, 1.5 times more carbon dioxide will be made, and 17 times more water is used. So this is a tremendous amount of harm done by moving from plastic to paper. And this is what we're being encouraged to do. I weighed a Kroger bag. Their plastic bag weighs 5.5 grams, and their paper bag from the same company, from Kroger, weighs 60 grams. So you're going from 5.5 grams of waste to 60 grams of waste, and wasting water and wasting energy and creating more CO2. And somehow politicians and green groups think that's a great plan. It doesn't make any sense to me. And you can see on the right here is the link to the place where I found this. So I'm not one of these journalists, right, who pops up something for a few quick clicks and leaves it at that. I had to do a tremendous amount of work. It took me a year to read all of this stuff and present you with the data and present you with the link so you can go and check the scientific citations to verify all of this for yourself. But as you see, this is in inverted commas. I'm literally quoting word for word because otherwise somebody's going to accuse me of spin. So I quote wherever I can, word for word, verbatim from every single report. And you see, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so here's an example that comes up all the time. I see this on LinkedIn every week. Somebody's asking, should we go from PET bottles to glass or aluminium? You know, glass and aluminium, we can remelt them. Aren't they wonderful? They must be the best solution. So what does the life cycle analysis say? I've got more than one of these, but here's just one of them. And we see that if we were to go from PET at the bottom here with a value of 11 energy units to aluminium, we've got about 50% more energy used. If we go to glass, it's about 2.5 times more energy to make a glass bottle. If we look at greenhouse gases, we're more than doubling the greenhouse gas if we go from PET to aluminium. And this is for the same volume of drink contained, right? This has all been normalized, so it's not like different sizes or anything. It's the same volume of drink. Does this sound sensible to you? I mean, who is going to queue up to be using 50% more energy, generating double the waste, and using 2 or 3 times, creating 2 or 3 times more the CO2? It doesn't make sense. Nobody's checking these facts. Everybody's going by gut feeling, and gut feeling just isn't good enough when it comes to the environment. This is the future of our children we're talking about here. People can at least bother to check the facts before they make wild decisions that will have consequences for future generations. So this is in the book, and at the end of this talk, there will be free access to everybody who attended through the SPE for the book, so you can all read everything online with even more science and so forth. So this is not something I'm doing for money, right? I did all of this work for free. Not a single penny was given to me, and I'm giving away the book for free because I care about having solid facts out there and not making policies based on fantasy. Okay, so here's an example. It would be a bad idea and cause a tremendous amount of harm to go from PET to glass. And this is another misconception, right? This is how people are approaching recycling now, right? They say, okay, glass and aluminium can be recycled indefinitely, they say, right? So therefore, let's use those. And I'm thinking, what kind of crazy mentality is that? Let's take the 2 worst materials we can think of and use them again and again and again, burning through that amount of energy and creating waste and all of the rest of it again and again and again. Why would you pick the least green materials and decide to use them for infinity? That is ridiculous. What you want to do is take the PET bottle, because it has the lowest impact, and recycle that. And they are collected and recycled 12 times mechanically. You know, you just melt them, make a new bottle or something else. And then at the end of that, you chemically recycle it. You dissolve the PET and you reform new PET. So it's also infinitely recyclable. And it's not fantasy. People are doing a lot of that right now. Okay, so there's another myth dispelled. Why are we moving from the greenest solution again to something not as green? And here's an example, right? Hopefully everyone's seen this. We know that to make glass, we're melting sand, right? We're talking a couple thousand degrees here. Things are glowing red hot. And this is where a lot of the environmental impact comes from. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to look at that molten lava, basically, to make a piece of glass and realize that is a whopping amount of energy. And that's what's coming out in the life cycle analysis. We're burning huge amounts of coal and other forms of electricity to create these glass bottles because they have to be melted. It doesn't make sense. The same thing for metal. Here's metal making process, right? I mean, you don't have to be Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking to realize that that is a hot process, right? There's a giant amount of energy going into that, and that's why it's not green. Okay, so just to sum up, if we were to take the United States alone and replace plastic bottles, we would be doing a lot of damage. So plastics are saving enough fuel to fuel 18 million passenger vehicles, to fill 500,000 Olympic swimming pools, and so on. So going from plastics, people are always saying, I'm removing plastic, right? I replaced plastic. I reduced my plastic consumption by 1,000 tons. And they never tell you, oh yeah, I replaced it with 4,000 tons of cardboard, right? Whenever you're removing plastic, you have to think, what are you replacing it with? What's the impact and how much waste are you generating? Okay, and again, see at the bottom, here's the quotation where you can go and look up these things. Just put them into Google or check on my website, and it will take you right to those reports so you can read it for yourself. So having read about 50 life cycle analyses or 100, I don't know how many, it's a lot, trends start to emerge. So officially for a life cycle analysis, you have to take, let's say, a PET bottle. You have to say, I'm based in wherever, Chicago. And you have to add up all the transportation and where's the nearest PET manufacturing plant based on your location, based on that specific item. It's a lot of work and it's specific only to where you are, right? So it varies. So you can't say that this is the greenest product there and it's necessarily the greenest somewhere else. But what you can do is look at a lot of life cycle analyses, as I did, and try to get an idea what the ranking is. And this is the ranking that comes out. The greenest material is wood, right? If you take wood decking, for example, it beats the pants out of plastic for greenness. Just a chunk of wood, right? You take a chunk of wood, you saw those pieces of lumber, put it down as decking, and that beats plastic decking. And it's the same for corks, wine corks, right? A natural piece of cork is greener in life cycle analysis than a plastic cork, right? And why would I tell you that? If I was some plastic nut, I would say plastic was the best for everything, but I'm not. I'm a real scientist who wants to tell you what I find, whether or not it suits a particular cause, right? I don't have an agenda other than to get you some facts. So wood beats the pants out of plastic. The trouble with wood is we can't make everything out of wood. We can't make mobile phones out of it. We can't make our cars out of it because they would weigh too much and burn too much oil and so forth. So wood is kind of limited in what we can use it for. But when you can use wood or plastic and there's not too much, shaping and stuff going on, too much other things happening, just a chunk of wood, basically, it will beat plastic pretty much every time. So plastic usually beats cardboard. So for example, if I look at shopping bags, grocery bags, plastic wins. If I look at mailing envelopes, that's been looked at and plastic wins again. So if you look at banknotes, plastic wins every time as well. So there are cases where I've seen paper beating plastic, but it seems to be, in general, plastic is the greenest solution. Then we got paper and cardboard. And then we got steel, that beats aluminium, and that beats glass. So that's just an idea, right? If you don't have a life cycle analysis because they haven't been done for everything and you're not sure, this is a good kind of rule of thumb. And another way you can look at it is, which is the cheapest product, right? Because if you think about what goes into a life cycle analysis, it's materials cost and the amount of time it takes to get them and the transportation and the energy and all of that. And if you add all those things up, you end up with more or less the cost to make the material. So it's not a perfect analogy, but if you're in a store and you're looking at a paper straw and it costs twice as much as a plastic one and it weighs twice as much, you can be sure the plastic one is greener. Okay, so we've looked at what's greenest, and we found out that plastics are usually greenest. That's interesting, right? That's not what we're being told because no one's bothering to check. Now let's look at waste, right? So as soon as you tell somebody, and I've had this, you tell them plastic's greenest, they go, oh, well, I don't care. What about the waste? So I had to go and read 50 or 100 articles about waste. And what did I find? This is the image that we're given online. We are told that we're drowning in waste. There's this guy and he's just drowning in waste. It's all due to plastic, right? This is what we're told. So what's the reality? This is taken right from the EPA website. You can go right there after the talk and look at these numbers yourself. And this is household trash in the USA. And what do we see? A couple of things leap out. One is that there's a lot of types of waste. And another one is that plastics are about 13%. Paper and cardboard in comparison is about double that. So that's interesting, right? If you had $1 million or if you wanted to do good, right? Let's say you wanted to save the world from waste and you looked at this pie chart, would you spend 99% of your effort talking about and acting on and legislating 13% of the problem, right? It doesn't make sense, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about waste. We definitely should. But why would 99% of the LinkedIn posts and the media articles and the TV shows be about plastics when it's only 13% of the problem? If you want to address this pie chart, surely we should be looking at all of these areas and trying to do something that's good for the planet, make the biggest impact. I mean, if you had only a limited amount of money, you'd probably be looking at paper and cardboard and saying, hey, we have to do something about that. It's out of control. But nobody is doing that. Nobody's thinking logically. Nobody's checking the facts. And that's worrying to me as a scientist. Okay, so here's some more data from the EPA. There's the link at the bottom. You can go and find it yourself. And we see this is the total waste generation in millions of tons in blue against the waste per capita, like pounds per person per day in black. And what we find is that waste was going up and up and up until about the 90s. And then it's sort of leveled off. When we're told that we're drowning in waste, right, this is getting worse and worse. And it's not true, right? The actual waste production per person and overall waste production has actually leveled off. Nobody will tell you that, but it's right there on the EPA website. And they studied this and they said, well, what's going on? It used to be that we were making more and more waste per person, and now it's leveled off. What changed? What changed in the 90s to make that happen? And so the references at the bottom here, the role of plastics in decoupling municipal waste and economic growth in the USA. And what did they find when they analyzed the data? They found that plastics consumption increased 84 times between 1960 and 2013. And you would think, holy moly, that's a problem, right? Plastic waste has gone up. But what they found out was that the plastic was replacing a lot of other material. So the overall waste consumption went down. Plastic is actually reduced waste. That was their dramatically reduced waste. That is their conclusion. And this is a peer-reviewed paper, right? So this is interesting. You can understand how the public got the wrong idea about plastics, because at the same time as plastic production and use was going up by 80 times, they must have been like, wow, the world's drowning in plastic. But what they didn't see was 1 pound of plastic replaced 3 or 4 pounds of something else. And so the overall waste went down, and nobody's paid attention to that. That's very, very important. So now we know plastics are 12% of waste, and they've dramatically reduced waste, right? So why would you be so ardently against plastics if you look at the facts and see that, of course, I'm not for waste. Waste is not a good idea. We should all act to reduce waste. But plastics is definitely not the problem. If anything, it's a solution. Here's an example, right? People will say to you, naively maybe, let's remove plastics. And what would happen? We know it takes 3 to 4 pounds of other material. There's a link on the right to tell you the report that I'm drawing this from. 3 to 4 pounds of replacement to replace 1 pound of plastic. So here on the left, we have all of this pie chart broken down. Let's take away the blue plastic part. We've got a gap here. And this looks like great. Look at this. We've removed plastic. We've saved the world. Look at that reduction. But what we actually find is that we've replaced plastic with 3 or 4 times more of these other materials. And now we've got way, way more overall waste like we had in the old days before plastics came on the scene. So that would be a tremendously bad idea. It sounds good at first thought, but it just doesn't add up. Okay. So we're told in the Western world, right? You're monsters. You're creating a problem. We hear nothing but that we're terrible people in the US and in Europe and so forth, and that we're creating all this waste and we're bad people, right? So let's look at a graph. This is from Our World in Data. You can check the link at the bottom, and we see that that's right. America and Europe and the other more developed countries, let's say, they generate more waste, and so we're monsters, right? We have to feel terrible. We have to open our wallets. We have to give money to charities and so forth, and make our conscience feel better. But let's look at the next graph, right, which looks at the mismanagement of that waste. Where is waste mismanaged? Oh, there's none mismanaged in the USA or Canada or Europe or Australia. Even though these places are making a large amount of waste, they are not mismanaging it. It's being mismanaged in these other countries which haven't caught up, right? They don't have recycling facilities. They don't have as many trash cans as they need. Maybe their government's wasted their money on something else or whatever. They're just chronologically behind us, right? We can see that Europe and America and other places have had long enough to put all these infrastructure in place, and there doesn't have to be a mismanagement of waste. We're not doing it, and it won't be the case in those countries either in, let's say, 10 or 20 years, especially if we help them, right? So we don't have to feel that bad in these countries, because although we're generating waste, we're not really responsible for a lot of the mismanaged waste. So it's not as bad for the environment as you would think. And I know some people on this call are thinking, oh, but you're shipping your waste to other countries and disposing of it there. Some of that is happening, and that's not a good thing. It's being legislated against, but it's a very, very small proportion compared to the overall numbers we're looking at here. So that doesn't come anywhere near close to explaining this difference between waste generated and mismanaged waste. So it's something that's being legislated against, and it's getting ameliorated all the time. So why would they focus on the Americans and the Europeans and make them feel bad? Why is it that we are being pummeled all the time with what bad people we are and how we need to do more? Probably because that's where the money is, right? So if you're an environmental group and you want to get a load of money, there's no better way than to make the rich people feel bad and hope that they open their pockets to appease their conscience. That's where the money is, and so that's where they devote their promotional activities, even though that's not where the problem is. Okay, so we've looked at what's green and waste, and we got a message which is very, very different. It's factual, and it's very different to what we're told. And now let's look at litter, because that's the next thing someone will say to you. What about the litter? I don't care about the other two things. Now you've shown me that. I'm worried about litter. And this is an interesting one. First of all, I got to say that the plastic bag is about the ugliest thing I've ever seen, right? I'm a plastic material scientist, but I just find them ugly. They're just so incredibly unappealing to look at. And the other thing is it's kind of an optical illusion. Both of the images you see here are 5 grams of plastic, right? On the left, we've got 5.5 gram Kroger bag. And on the right, we've got a 5.5 gram game die from a gaming board, right? And you can see that the plastic bag's kind of an optical illusion because although it's only 5 grams of plastic, it takes a giant amount of visual space. So when you see one outside, you think, good God, what an amazing amount of pollution or litter. And it really isn't. It's only a very small amount. So because plastics are very effective, and we've worked to make these bags thinner and thinner and lighter and more efficient over decades, it generates this illusion that there's way more plastic waste than there really is. So that's one thing to think about. And it's ugly, right? You look at it and you just go, wow, that's not appealing. So what's responsible for this litter, right? We see the guy on the left is a good citizen and the person on the right is not. And they've done studies on this. They film this every year. They literally go out in cars and they film people littering. And they find out that over 80% of litter in US is dropped intentionally, right? So you can literally stand there and film them dropping the litter, even near a trash can, right? So you can go and find the numbers for this at Keep America Beautiful and other places. People are standing there and intentionally dropping this litter. And then guess what they do? They turn around and they blame Coca-Cola, they blame Nestle, they blame, I don't know, the apple orchard. It's unbelievable how ridiculous these people are. I mean, even my children can understand if I drop a Coke can on the floor, that's not Coke's responsibility, that's my fault. I mean, this is something that children can grasp, and I don't know why people are so crazy about getting away from blaming themselves and looking in the mirror that they'll blame anyone else. They want this extended supplier responsibility. They want Coke to come and pick up your cans after you. They'll have your shoe company coming and tying your laces for you next. I don't follow the logic. In the Western world, usually we drop litter only to a very small extent, and what we do drop is, cleaned up using our taxes, and that's how it's going to work in the other countries too, as soon as they catch up. Okay, so here's an example, right? People will say, I don't believe you. I don't believe that that litter is due to people. Prove it to me. And here's a proof, right? Most people don't know that for decades, a large proportion of the banknotes have been made of plastic. They've done it for decades in Australia and several other countries because they're a lot more durable, right? And they're greener too, according to every study that they've done. So let's talk about these banknotes. There's 8 billion printed a year, plastic ones, right? That's one per person in the world every year, right? How many do you see on the street when you go for a walk? How many do you see on the beach when you go on a holiday? Like, these things float, right? They're small, they're easily lost. There's one printed per person in the world every year, and you've never seen one, have you? I haven't. I'm over 50. I've never once seen one of these plastic banknotes or any banknote on the floor. So people only litter when the object has no value, right? These are small, easily lost pieces of plastic, but because they have a value, people are careful with them and they don't drop them. So this proves to you that people are littering. And the exact same logic applies to credit cards. Everyone in America has on average 2.5 credit cards, right? Every adult. And you never find them, right? I've never found one on the ground. And if one were to land on the ground, it would kind of clean itself up by magic because it has a value, the same as the money. So this very simple example shows us categorically, undeniably, that litter is due to people and not due to the plastic. Because if it was due to the plastic, we'd be drowning in plastic banknotes. Okay, so here's another thing about litter, right? This is what we see when we go on holiday. This is a tourist beach. We see all of that litter and we think it's coming from the sea, but it isn't. It's coming from the tourists. You can see the people back here, right? This is a tourist resort. And it's been proven that all of this litter, almost 100% of it, comes from the tourists. And you know what they do? They clutter up the beach until it's horrible, and then they leave it because they say, this is ugly, I don't want to go on holiday here anymore, and they go to another pristine beach and mess that one up, right? So, but of course, they can never blame themselves, these people. They can't admit that that's their own litter, right? So they would never say that, and they assume that it's coming from the ocean, from other people, and so forth. And let's take a look instead at, people study these beaches, right? These studies go on for decades, so we know exactly what's on all these beaches and where it came from. Let's look at a non-tourist beach. Let's look at an isolated beach that people can't get to easily. This is what it looks like, right? And you know it, right? You've been on holiday in a place like this. An isolated beach has either no litter, or if it does have some litter, It won't be, you won't really find bottles and cans or cigarettes or any of that stuff. What you find is a bit of fishing equipment. You'll find fishing nets. That's what they find when they look at isolated beaches where there's no tourists. So this is a misconception, right? Of course, you go to the tourist beach. That's the one by definition that you go to. That's where tourists go, right? So you see the beach, and that's what you think all beaches look like. And there's some huge problem. And yet you go to all these other beaches, and there really is no big problem because there's no tourists there dropping all their rubbish. So that's, and this has been studied, and I give the references in my book. Okay, so here's the blame problem, right? A guy drives his car into the tree, and the last thing he wants to do is blame himself, right? He'll do anything. The tree jumped in front of me, right? The car suddenly skidded off to the side. The tires burst. But no, if you really want to address a problem, you have to look at yourself, right? Address the real problem. If you blame the tree or blame the car, or in the case of plastic, you blame Coca-Cola or blame Nestle or whoever, or P&G, Unilever, any of these companies, it's just childish. I mean, come on, this is obvious. If you drop a piece of litter, that's your fault. You bought the product, and you shouldn't drop it. Expecting Coke or anyone to come and clean up your litter, to me, just doesn't make sense. It's the same as at the end of life. I don't expect Levi's to come and get my jeans. I don't expect Ford to come and pick up my car when I'm finished with it. You buy a product, it's yours, and you dispose of it properly. Maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems that simple to me. Okay, so we looked at a lot of topics, and now the next big one is ocean litter and microplastics. Everyone's freaking out about microplastics. This is the one area that when I started to read the papers, I actually got concerned because I was like, wow, there's a lot of papers that claim to show harm, right? You can see it in the abstract, you can see it in the title, you can see people talking about it online. And I thought, wow, maybe this whole thing is going to blow up here when I start to read these papers, and maybe there's going to really be something that is frightening. So I really looked at these papers. I downloaded every one I could find, and let me show you what I found. This is what we're told is the case, but that's not really the case when you look at the data. This is what you really find, right? So this is a summary of decades of work by many, many groups, right? Trolling up and down in boats with nets, fishing plastic out of the sea and measuring it. And what you find is that in these in the open sea, that's these lower things, right, outside of the gyres, you get maybe 20-50 grams of plastic per square kilometer, which is really, really low, right? I'll try and convert these into numbers that might make more sense to you in a second. And then even in the middle of these, they call them patches or gyres, right? We see these pictures online of these giant floating islands the size of Texas that are supposed to be out in the sea, right? The concentration in those gyres is, as you can see, let's say 500 grams. So about a pound of plastic per square kilometer, right? Even in the highest concentrated areas, which they call patches, that's the concentration, 500 grams per square kilometer. That doesn't mean a lot to people, so let me convert that into other numbers. So they've been monitored for decades, as I said. They claim to be huge floating islands, but the people who've studied them said there's not nearly enough plastic there to even call it an island or a patch or a soup. It would be the weakest soup you've ever had. If you ordered that soup, it would just be a clear bowl of water. So let me give you some perspective. 500 grams per square kilometer is 2 pounds a square mile if you're living in the US, right? So if I convert that into something you can picture, right? If we took an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water, that would be less than 1 game die in that whole Olympic-sized pool. That's the maximum concentration that you'll find in those gyres, right? And I'm not saying it should be there, right? It definitely shouldn't be there. It's still pollution, but it's not a giant floating island, and it's not going to tangle up, it's not, you can swim through it and you can't tell it's there. You can sail through it. You don't even know it's there, right? We're talking about, on average, not in the gyres now, but average in the sea, one very small piece of plastic, like your little fingernail, per 130 bathtubs of water, right? That is the weakest soup I've ever heard of. So I'm not defending pollution, but what I am saying is, if we want to address a problem, let's not start with a bunch of lies, right? Because lies just make people excited, and they may make them open their pockets and give money to their favorite environmental group, but it doesn't help us address a problem. If we're adults and we want to do the right thing for our kids, let's not start with a bunch of lies and base policies based on that. Let's look at actual numbers, and these are rock solid numbers. Okay, so we've looked at these imaginary floating islands which don't exist. And let's look at the next thing, microplastics. We're told that these microplastics are poisoning the fish. Is that true? I decided to look at it. So what we find in these studies is that the studies are just junk science. It's some of the worst science I've ever seen in my life. These people should literally be, in my opinion, fired. That's how bad the science is. So what do I mean by that, right? It's a strong accusation. How do I say that as a scientist, as a professional scientist? So I'm a scientist who's reviewed scientific papers, right? I'm one of the ones who gets asked to say whether this should be published or not, right? And this is just horrendous work that never should have been published. I'll tell you why, right? The plastic that's actually in the ocean is polyethylene and polypropylene. That's the vast majority. You can find the exact numbers in my book. It's like, I don't know, from memory, like 90% polyethylene and polypropylene. What does that mean, right? I mean, we eat, polyethylene is a Ziploc bag, right? We eat out of it. It's food contact safe. Polypropylene is like the original Tupperware, polypropylene, right? These are two of the safest materials we know. That's what the vast majority of microplastics in the ocean is. But when they do these studies, they don't do them on those plastics. They pick a completely different type of plastic. Why do they do that, right? It's meaningless. If I want to know if apples are safe, I don't go and study cherries, right? That would be preposterous. And yet that's what these people have done. Instead of studying the plastics which are actually in the ocean, they went and studied a type of plastic which doesn't exist anywhere in the ocean. And that's cross-linked polystyrene particles. So isn't it preposterous? Can you even believe what you're hearing? Literally look at the experimental section of 80% of the studies in this area, and you'll see that they use the wrong kind of plastic. But that wasn't enough for them, right? They used up to 100 million times more than you actually find in the ocean, right? So let's say I want to know if apples are safe. I feed you an apple a day for 10 years, and I see if you're still okay, right? If I fed you 100 million apples a day, right? That wouldn't look good, would it? And it wouldn't be because apples are poisonous. It would be because I've just overwhelmed you with apples. You probably explode after the 100th one. So they use the wrong size of particles. They use the ones with the wrong surface science, the wrong surface charge. They use ones which have got toxins in them. And they use ones which are fluorescent. So fish are actually attracted to them because they're fluorescing, right? Which real microplastic doesn't. It's hard to imagine how they could have done these experiments worse. It's like they must have just been so dying to come up with a bad result, or they're the world's worst scientists. It's absolutely shocking. These people should be ashamed of the science that they've done. I'm ashamed for them as a scientist. So this is most of the science that's been done. But what happens when they do it right? So there are some studies where they actually looked at the toxicity of polyethylene and polypropylene. And what did they find? Oh, no problem. No toxicity whatsoever, right? Fish eat them, goes right through, no change. Why? Because it's food safe, edible plastic. But that wasn't enough for some people, right? I found one study or two studies where they took polyethylene and polypropylene. They showed it was safe, but they didn't stop there. What did they do then? Then they soaked the polyethylene and polypropylene beads in poison. And then they fed it to the fish and said, oh, look, the fish got sick. The plastic's poisonous. And I'm like, the plastic isn't poisonous. I could soak anything in poison and then put it in with the fish. I could pour the poison, like the last slide, I could pour the poison right on the fish and kill it, right? That's easy. That doesn't prove the plastic is toxic. That proves that you shouldn't have soaked it in poison. And so what happens in the sea, and some people have pointed this out, what actually happens in the sea is that you have microplastics, which shouldn't be there. I'm not saying that they should, but what they do is absorb the chemicals, the toxic chemicals you find in the sea get absorbed into those microplastics, and that ends up protecting the fish, right? Because it's no longer in the water, it's stuck inside the plastic. So it soaks up that toxin. This is absolutely proven and protects the fish. Even if the fish eats the plastic, the toxin remains within the microplastic and the fish is protected. So the real story is microplastics are a miracle cure to save the fish, right? That could have been an equally valid headline, but of course that wouldn't have got as many reads. So they came up with this distorted science to try and make there look like there was a problem when there wasn't one. So this is absolutely appalling, and I hope there are serious consequences for these people. Okay, so we've addressed a lot of topics. We're getting nearer to the end now. Let's look at degradation. And this is the reason that this whole thing kicked off for me, right? I did this, as I said, without pay. But one day, my kids came home from school, and they'd been taught that plastics last hundreds of years. And I knew that was a straight out lie. And I don't care enough about this whole topic. I don't care enough, to be honest, about the environment more than the next person. I'm not passionate about the environment. I'm not passionate about plastics as materials and the environment either. But I am passionate about not telling lies to kids, right? If we teach our kids a bunch of lies. They'll grow up to be A, confused, and B, to vote for very strange policies that don't make sense. So let's keep it real, people, and make sure that everything we say, especially the things we tell teachers, is true. So let's look at degradation. Here is a picture of a kind of a landfill, a dump where they put all the stuff. And one of the big knocks against plastic is they say, hey, it doesn't degrade. Well, that's a strange thing, right? Because landfills are designed to prevent degradation. And they've literally buried, they literally looked in landfills and dug down in them and found stuff from 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. Newspapers you can still read. I've got a whole book on it here called Rubbish. You can look it up on Amazon, right? Newspapers you can still read, carrots that look like they've just been buried yesterday, steaks, avocado, guacamole, everything you can imagine in there, 10 and 20 and 30 years old, good as new almost, because there's no oxygen down there. Landfills are designed to stop degradation because we don't want the carbon dioxide coming off, right? So this is a big misconception. People think plastics are bad because they don't degrade. We don't want things in a landfill to degrade. We want them not to degrade. That's why they're designed that way. And even the organic materials you think of as degradable, paper or food, are untouched. Okay, so there's one misconception. Here's a study on plastic bags. I was telling you about plastics degrading. So they took degradable bags, they took regular polyethylene bags, and they took bags which had a chemical put in them to make them degrade faster. They took all the bags and all of them. So this is again quotations, right? I'm not putting any spin on this. Every one of the bags had degraded and fallen to pieces into, just dust in 9 months. Even a regular polyethylene grocery bag, if you leave it outside, not buried in a landfill, just lying on the ground, degrades and disappears in 9 months. So it doesn't matter whether it's a degradable bag or a regular bag, they all degrade because thin pieces of plastic like that degrade about as fast as a leaf would. It's the chemistry of plastics, they're organic polymers, and so are leaves, so are sticks, so is cotton, all of these things we think of, paper. It's all made of very similar chemistry and they degrade at similar rates. And they also found that many of these bags sold as degradable were in the ocean for, I think, 3 months. They pulled it out and they filled it with groceries, and it was as strong as the day it was put in the ocean. There was no effect. So the bags that they're claiming are degradable are not always degradable. And the regular polyethylene bags, there are 2 studies, and both of them show that the regular polyethylene bag degrades into fragments and disintegrates in less than a year. So that's not 100 years, is it? Or 500 years or 1,000 years like my kids were taught. They were taught an outright lie. The regular bags are degrading in less than a year. Okay, and all polymer scientists know this. I mean, if you look at the polymer stabilizer market, it's billions of dollars. We spend decades trying to stop plastics from degrading because it's one of the biggest problems that plastics have. All right, so let's look at some numbers here. If we take a PE bag here on the left, or PE bag, for example, film, it will degrade in soil in 1 to 3 years. That's what we see. If we look at a piece of paper, about the same. PLA, PHB, it's about the same. Leaves, carrots, steak, it's about the same, 1 to 3 years. These are approximate, but it gives you an idea. Do any of them degrade in a landfill? No, none of them do, because there's no oxygen there. Nothing's degrading. Do they release CO2 and methane when they degrade? Yes. So why are people so obsessed with these degradable bags, right? They want everything to be degradable. And degradable means, by definition, you're creating a giant amount of global warming gas. Does that sound like something to be encouraged? You're taking a PE or PE film, PP film, and replacing it with something which degrades to give CO2. And saying that's an advantage. I don't really see where the advantage is, especially when we know that life cycle analysis shows these materials are greener. Why would you move to a less green material that has no advantages and costs more? I don't really understand the driving force for that. And I know that you're going to say, well, are these degrading? Are they going all the way to CO2? How long does that take? Or are they just forming fragments? But as we've just seen, well, everything forms fragments, right? A leaf breaks in half, it forms microfragments, eventually it degrades all the way. I've got some data on that. But it's not important really, because leaves degrade into fragments, plastic degrade into fragments. Those fragments get smaller and smaller until the whole chemistry has been degraded. It takes a while for any kind of material. And we just saw that those microfragments are not really toxic anyway. Okay, so what's driving this whole thing, right? Well, there's a lot of deception and greed going on here. So the plastics industry is an industry, right? Chemical industry, that's an industry. Everyone hates big industry, right? Except for they produce all the materials we actually use every day and love, and makes our lives possible. What people don't realize is that the journalism industry, right? That's an industry too. They need clicks. They need to get revenue, and they'll write pretty much everything that gets a click without checking it and without caring. I'm not saying everyone does it, but as you saw from the straws and more fish than plastic in the sea, people repeat any kind of nonsense without bothering to check it. So they're making money, right, by deceiving us and making sensationalist titles. And the other people making money from this are some of the green groups. Are not really green groups. They're more like groups which will say whatever it takes to get your money out of your pocket. So let's take a look at one particular example. This is what's driving everything in the world, right? It should come as no surprise to you that just as plastics is an industry, this whole green thing is an industry too, and a lot of it's about money, and a lot of it's not really directed at helping the environment whatsoever. So here are some things about Greenpeace. These are some, these are headlines copied and pasted from online. So these are not accusations I'm making. These are just things taken from articles. They've been thrown out of many countries because they say these guys are not a valid. They're not a valid charity. They're not bringing us anything. They have no function. And so they're losing their charitable status in some places. And then there was another very interesting case where one company was accused again and again, and they eventually went to court. And Greenpeace's defense in court was that not to come with science, right? They didn't come back and say, here, everything we said was true, here's the science to prove it. No, they didn't have any science. Instead, they said that their statements were non-verifiable statements of subjective opinion. And I think everyone here can tell what that really means, right? So their defense was not to say we have science or that we're speaking the truth. That was their defense. And that tells us a lot, right? Apparently, they're more interested in getting interesting headlines and riling people up than they are in making sure that what they say is backed by facts. And that may come as a shock to you, but I mean, these people have $400 million a year, according to Wikipedia, if I understood it correctly. So why are they not just going and putting nets across these rivers and cleaning up the plastic and doing something? With the kind of funding these guys have got, they could be solving the world's problems on their own, but apparently they're more interested in getting the money than they are in solving the problems. So that's at least my interpretation of what I'm seeing here. So that's the problem. If we've got journalists who are not checking anything, and we've got other people more interested in raising money than actually helping, that is not heading us in the right direction. Okay, so here are some conclusions. As we've seen, plastics, primarily polyethylene, polypropylene, and PET, are usually the greenest option, except for wood. If you were to replace them, you would do an incredible amount of damage, meaning vastly more CO2, vastly more energy, vastly more waste and water. Litter is 100% proven to be down to human behavior. So blaming materials or companies is, in my opinion, very naive and counterproductive. Ocean plastic comes from 10 rivers in Africa and Asia, and the rest from the fishing industry. That's pretty well established. Certain green groups and companies are doing more harm than good. And I think that, I'm not saying that we should be wasting, right? I think overall we should reduce waste. We should reuse things. We should dispose of things properly. And we should recycle more than we do now. And we should prefer the greenest material. And then we should recycle it, right? The people are doing exactly the opposite. They're taking metal and glass, which are two of the worst materials, and saying, hey, let's recycle those a bunch of times. Let's take the worst material I can find and use it again and again. No, we should be taking the greenest material, which is usually plastic, according to life cycle analysis, everyone, that I've seen, and then making sure we start with the greenest material to save the environment, and then reuse it and reduce it as much as we can. That's the logical approach in my mind. So I think that's pretty much the end of it. And I'd like to leave you with one final thought. You can be for the environment or you can be against plastics, but you can't be both at the same time, right? Pick. I don't mind which one you pick. Everyone's an adult. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But if you actually do care about the environment, the facts say that plastics are the answer, not the problem. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, Chris, thank you very much. That was a lot of information covered in a short amount of time. We do have a lot of questions here. And just before getting into them, we should remind everybody that, yes, the presentation will be made available afterwards. And yes, the recording will also be made available afterwards. At the time here, there's over 50 questions. Some of them that were posted as comments are not going to be included. We'll try to group some of these by subject or category if we can. And if we don't get to all of them, we will do our best to try and get back, and we can talk to Chris afterwards about posting something that might address some of these. Is that fair enough, Chris?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so we'll start at the beginning and we'll see how much we get through this here. So there was quite a few questions about LCAs and whether or not they take into account the effect that the littered plastic will have on marine life. So for example, do LCAs take into account deaths of fish and other life due to the various plastics that make it into the environment?
I'm not sure, but I see those as two completely separate issues, right? The problem is we should start with the greenest material, and then we should make sure that people don't litter it, or if it is littered, it's cleaned up. So I don't see those as being really related. One doesn't really pertain to the other one. We start with what's greenest by LCA, and then we take care of the rest of it by, if it was up to me, a litterer would have a $1,000 spot fine, and they would have to clean up garbage in their own street in front of their neighbors for a week, right? And the shame of that would reduce littering 99% overnight. So I don't think that the answer to irresponsible behavior is to change materials. And let's say we did replace plastics, right? Let's say that we blame plastics for, let's say we got a plastic net, right? Those are often in the sea and it's trapping fish. So let's replace the plastic with a rope net, right? We've replaced the plastic, we've got a less green material, and it's still trapping fish, right? The old ropes trap fish too. So I don't really see that that's an improvement.
Okay. And also related to data about LCAs, can you comment on how much of reuse or reusability is taken into concern, or do LCAs assume one use of each material?
I'm not an expert in LCA, so somebody else would have to look into that and make a comment. The trouble is now, as I said, that what people do, and the LCAs do it too, right? They take today's recycling rate and they calculate how green something is based on that. And that's a mistake. We should find the greenest material. And it's plastic, right? We know it's plastic. We've seen in every study almost that it's plastic, right? And then we should say, okay, we're not recycling plastic enough. Let's put in the infrastructure to do it, as they have done in Europe, right? Not the other way around. Not let's say we're recycling glass and metal at a high rate, and although we know they're awful for the environment, let's go with those because we've already got the recycling plants in place. That's an insane way of approaching things. So I think it has to be the other way around. Start with what's greenest and then make sure that we recycle them.
Okay. On a data question specifically, I don't recall the slide number, Chris, but there was one source where you quoted 12x PET bottle for recycling. One of the listeners here has a different data set showing that it was about 6 times, assuming closed loop. Is that source on that slide?
The source is, it's either on the slide or it's in the book, and you can look up Norway BBC PET bottle, and you'll see that in Norway, they recover 97% of the bottles and they recycle each one 12 times. And then they go to, I think, chemical recycling after that. So it will be different in different countries. I think Germany gets like 93% of their bottles back. And in each case, they do it by putting on, they have to assign a value to it by doing a deposit scheme and making the bottles have a value so that you give them back. So, those are real numbers, and the source is cited in the book and on my website. Okay,
you mentioned wood at one point. What about treated wood? Is that the same as wood when it's thought about in LCAs?
The wood that I was referring to there was some sort of chemically treated wood to stop it from rotting. So again, that's referenced in the book exactly which wood. I think it was ACQ, if I remember the abbreviation. I think it was some nasty copper-based chemical that they used to treat the wood and stop it from degrading. So that was the comparison between that kind of wood and plastic lumber.
Okay. The textile business is 10 times the size of plastic packaging. Why isn't cloth a bigger piece of the pie chart?
I can't tell you, actually. I do know that when they looked at microfibers, there was a new paper last week. They looked at microfibers in the sea, and they found that only 8% of them were synthetic plastic, and the rest was natural fibers and animal fur. So everyone thinks that all of these microfibers in the ocean are synthetic plastics, and that's not the case. So maybe some of that's coming from the cloth clothes that we wear. Trying
to combine a few questions here. Speaking of cloths and PE synthetic clothing, as well as tires on roads. Have you explored the impact of other types of microparticles that make it into waterways beyond just plastics?
I have numbers for the tires and fibers and so forth on my website. There's a nice graphic there done in Tableau, which shows the breakdown of what is really in the oceans in terms of the source. There's road markings is a big one. City dust is a big one. Car tires is a big one. So there are different materials, and if you had a specific question, I'd have to look. I'm not the kind of guy to make up something or defend a position. I would have to look at the science and then make up my mind. And bear in mind, I'm unfunded here, and I'm one person, and I've got a real full-time job in addition to this. So I'm not like I'm not like some giant think tank where you can go in and they're getting funded hundreds of millions of dollars to have a team look at it. It's just me. So I'm doing the best job I can to present information for people, but I certainly cannot answer every question with my limited resources.
Fair enough. A few more here. In terms of volume and weight, plastic is less dense, so it takes up more space when people are talking about trash. Can you comment on the volume versus weight?
Yes, I have seen numbers on volume versus weight, and they're not as different as you think. So by the time that things are compressed into in a landfill, you find out that plastics are not really consuming more volume than the other materials. And the book to look at for that is called Rubbish. I think it's Rubbish ! Where they literally did archaeology on landfills, dug up things from 10, 20, and 30 and 40 years ago, and measured how much of each type of material was in each layer, how compressed it was. And they were surprised to find that plastics really wasn't that big a percentage. Like people are told that diapers take up 20% of landfills, and the actual number is 1%, right? So Procter & Gamble are always getting hammered for something that's just not true. And I really recommend that book.
And would that also touch on, you think, bulk density effects?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Do you want to comment, Chris, on the inability of certain countries to effectively manage waste where there is an abundance of plastic packaging?
Yeah, I find this one strange. I've got a few different thoughts. One is that they're just chronologically behind us, right? So decades ago, we had a problem with horse manure in New York. So they built brownstone buildings, which are way above the street level because it was literally a foot deep in manure, right? These are problems that people come against when they have a new technology. They have to put in legislation. They have to put in infrastructure to deal with it. And Europe's done it. America's done it. Many, many countries have done it. I go outside and walk for ages without seeing any litter. So it's not insurmountable. It's just these countries haven't got around to it yet. So I don't understand this supplier responsibility thing. If I buy a can of Coke, right? Let's say I'm in a really poor country. There's nobody buying Coke, right? There's not droves of people buying Coke and these disposable waste, ridiculous luxury products in a truly poor country. They're drinking water, right? So if you've got enough money to buy a Coke or a pair of Nikes or whatever it is that's being littered, right? You're paying your money, the government's collecting taxes on the sale, and then they put in a trash can and a facility to process it. Or they're corrupt and they don't put in those facilities and they expect someone else to do it. But in my mind, I don't see why we should ever expect a company to come and pick up our trash after us because we bought it and we're responsible for it.
In a related question, and again, just for everybody who's still listening here, there's a lot of questions, and we're trying to condense them as best we can into subcategories here. The topic of mismanaged waste has come up several times here because of low recycling rates, including here in the US. Do you have a definition, Chris, on mismanaged?
Well, if you put it in a landfill and it stays there, it's managed. Whereas if you put it in a big pile next to a river and it falls in the river and drifts off, it's mismanaged. So if you want a specific definition, I would look at those articles that I cited because they're very careful to define what they mean by mismanaged. While you're on that topic, right, everyone's talking about recyclability of plastics. They're telling us you can't recycle this, you can't recycle that. And that's another word that's being misused, right? You can recycle polyethylene, polypropylene, you can recycle black plastic, you can recycle PET. That's a scientific fact. No matter what you tell me, just because my regional facility down the road doesn't want to take a certain plastic because they're too lazy to process it, that doesn't make it unrecyclable. It is, as a scientific fact, recyclable. it's not being currently recycled maybe in my locality, but it is very dangerous to say that that material is unrecyclable, because it's a lie and it confuses people. So yeah, I think this terminology thing is important, and I wouldn't want to define, because I'm a scientist, right? I'm not going to make something up for you. I would direct you to that paper and you can read exactly how they defined mismanaged waste in that context.
So not all PE or PP is film. What about monolithic objects such as caps and bottles? They don't degrade in soil, so the chart is perhaps inaccurate. Why not point this out?
So that's a great point, right? So if I take a giant sequoia and you fell it, right, and this has been done, it sits there for 500 years untouched, right? You can't tell that it's been, you can't tell it wasn't yesterday that it fell over practically, because it's so thick, right? So yes, the thickness of a part does affect the degradation, how long it's going to take to vanish, but it's still degrading. So if I have a very thin part, so that's why I was comparing like for like, right? I compared a thin film with a leaf, which is a thin piece of organic material. If I were to compare a thicker part, let's say I was going to compare a PET bottle or a piece of Tupperware, maybe I would compare that to a pencil, right? How long would it take for a pencil thickness piece of wood to degrade? And that would give me a similar answer too. So my point is, they're all carbon substances. They're all degraded by very similar methods, including chemical attack. They biodegrade as well, despite what you've read in the literature. I've got tons of articles about degradation of PE and PP, and they degrade in sunlight as well. So you have to compare thickness for thickness. That's right. And you can choose with plastics. You can say, I want a plastic that degrades quickly if you want, or you can pack it full of stabilizers and make it last a long time if you want to, if you think that that's greener.
Quite a few people are commenting on the beaches they've traveled to around the world where they have seen litter and plastic washing up on the beaches. Obviously, you're one person doing a lot of work here. Do you want to comment on the actual presence of plastics and other litter on these remote beaches?
Well, if by definition they were on a tourist beach, they were looking at tourist litter, right? And that's been proven. You can check the articles I give in the book. I mean, did you go to a beach where you're the only one, right? You chartered a helicopter and went to a beach where no one else has ever been? Is that what you're saying? Because I doubt it. And if a large proportion of our audience has done that, then I invite them to take me on holiday with them next time, because people are going to beaches where people go that you can get to, and that's where the people leave their litter. So I'm not saying nothing comes from the sea, but when you see a beach with a bunch of litter like that, it's coming from the tourist, and that's been proven because the litter composition changes depending on where it is, right? Like there was one in South America where there were a ton of skewers that you don't find anywhere else, because the people in that area love to eat a certain type of barbecue with skewers, right? So you can tell by things like that.
I think maybe some of the divers, the diving community that listening here might take issue with that, but we're not here to solve every single comment and every single question. Let's talk a little bit about regulation and legislation. So in the US, for example, recyclers often talk about weak markets for recycled materials, including plastics, but also glass and paper. What do you think of mandated recycling content legislation as a way to help support weak markets for recycling?
Well, I think the plastics market has to be supported because, I said that the life cycle analysis somewhat is reflected in the price, right? So that's a problem for plastics. Plastics are super green, which means they're super cheap, which means they have no value at the end of life, right? So if I take the other extreme, I should say, and I actually heard somebody suggest this once, they said, let's make everything out of gold, because then nobody would throw it away. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense, because gold's expensive, because it's not easy to produce. You have to do a huge amount of mining, and it's terrible for the environment. So it's ironic, right, that the things which are worse for the planet, like aluminium, are recycled because there's so much energy embodied in them, right? You've put so much into making them that you want to get it back again, and it has a high price. Whereas plastics, which were green, has no value. So you have to assign a value with a deposit scheme, and you have to make sure that people put in the infrastructure. And there has to be a guaranteed market. We see companies like Nestle signing giant contracts to guarantee to take all that recycled material. Because if you don't, in a soft market like today, right, those companies go out of business. You can't have a long-term business recycling plastics because there are too many price swings and not enough money to be made, year in, year out. You'll be out of business one year when the market's soft, and you can't just pop back up again and resurrect yourself the next year. So yes, that does need to be supported because we know it's the greenest solution, and that's the best thing for the community.
So the density of most plastic is greater than the density of water. So the plastic that does sink perhaps has a longer term persistence in the environment. Do you have any comments on that? Was that covered in any of your studies?
Yes, it definitely does. So people say that PET bottles take forever to degrade, and that's not really the case. The studies show that it takes about 15 to 20 years. They do degrade relatively quickly. But sometimes you'll see a study where they literally take, I saw a study recently, they found 2 pieces of plastic, that's all they could find, like 30,000 feet down, where the water is super cold and there's no oxygen. And they said, oh, look, this seems to be degrading rather slowly. And I'm like, yeah, well, anything would degrade rather slowly with no oxygen in super cold water at 30,000 feet under the sea. So, but they could only find 2 pieces of plastic, right? What kind of study is that? So yes, it does have a big effect. And what amazes me, right, is that plastic's almost the only thing that floats, right? So in the book, it mentions billion, I think it was, I may be misquoting this, but I think it was 1 billion tons of ships, munitions, and chemical weapons, right? I'm talking about nerve gas here, have been put intentionally, sunk in the sea. And because it sank, nobody talks about it. You can find like 2 articles about it. Nobody cares. It's out of sight, out of mind. And then you see 1 PET bottle floating on the water and everyone's freaking out, right? Would you rather be worried about chemical weapons which are leaking and proven to leak and kill people at the bottom of the sea in 1 billion tons, or would you rather care about, you know, some food safe plastic floating on the top of the ocean? That's the way the human mind works, you know, out of sight, out of mind. Let's focus on what I see. That's in the book.
All right. Deb, can I just check in here in terms of time? We're at 12:06. We have plenty of questions left here, so I just want to see, do we want to do another 5 or 10 minutes? Chris, how do you feel about that?
I'm happy to keep going for a few more minutes.
Okay, well, we still have a lot of people listening here, and a lot of really good questions. So if we'll keep on, it's a very important topic, right? I mean, and to be clear, I mean, SPE as an organization here is providing a platform for this discussion. As an organization, SPE is not taking a position here. Chris's comments are his own based on what he's written and what he's studied. So we'll dig into some of these great questions here, because many people are coming from within SPE ranks, and I think plenty of other people are coming from without.
And don't forget, the whole book is available, right? So you can read a lot more there with a lot more scientific references and explanation than I can do in an hour.
Okay. Chris, what are your thoughts on bio-based traditional plastics like Braskem's bio-PE?
That's one I like, because I've looked into the life cycle analysis, and it's a bit hard to tell because I've seen different answers depending on where I looked. But in general, I think it's a good solution for the future. I think that's the way things are going. When you invent a totally new plastic, it doesn't behave like what we're used to, and there are huge switching costs. And they're usually not as good. The new materials are usually not as good mechanically as what they're replacing. So to make biodegradable-based PE and PP and nylons and PET, which are plastics we know, that's probably the best way forward, because there's no mystery about how to use them or redesigning parts or any of that stuff, and it can be recycled with all the rest of the material. So that's probably the most sensible way forward. And Braskem's one does seem to be pretty green from what I can tell.
And what about incineration or waste to energy? Can you comment on that?
Yes, that's in the book. And plastic gives as much energy as coal. If you burn plastic, it burns cleanly, that's proven, and it gives about as much energy as coal. So it's an incredibly good thing in terms of energy. If you wanted to take a piece of plastic, use it 10 or 20 times, and then burn it at the end of life, that's an incredibly green overall scenario. In terms of how much use you got out of it, it has the same energy at the end of as the oil you started with. It's unbelievable. It has as much energy as coal or oil. So that's actually in the book, and the fact that it burns cleanly is in the book. One thing it doesn't make sense to me is there's a lot of paper and cardboard burned, and nobody seems to have a problem with it. And yet most countries are not really burning plastic. I think Sweden burns a lot, but most countries aren't doing it, and I'm not sure why, because you can take a piece of plastic, use it for 20 years, recycle it a bunch of times, and then use it as fuel. That's a heck of a good proposition overall, and proven to work.
Well, I think a lot of the concern, as we're seeing some of the questions here about incineration, is additives that are included in plastics that may or may not be environmentally safe. Do you want to comment on the notion of additives?
Yeah, sure. So that's in the book too, and most plastics, so I'm talking about PE, PP, and PET, right? That's that's a majority, and polystyrene have almost no additives. And what they do have is like 200 parts per million of some FDA food grade stabilizer, right? Or a stearate, which is just like this, you know, the soap that you have in your bathroom. So these are very, very innocuous chemicals used in incredibly low loadings, and I don't really see a problem. There are some plastics that have way more and more suspicious chemicals in them, and maybe those shouldn't be candidates for burning, but the vast majority are just fine.
So in terms of fossil-based versus bio-based plastics, do you have an opinion, Chris? Do you have, or what does the data say in terms of environmental sustainability?
I don't think I have a conclusive answer on that. I couldn't say.
Okay. What about monomaterials? There's quite a few of the large companies are trying to move away from laminated or multi-material packages now and going over towards monomaterials.
Yeah.
What do you think about that in terms of enhancing reusability?
Right. So this is a complex subject. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, why wasn't it a monomaterial, right? The simplest thing you can ever make is just a film of one material, right? That's easy. Everyone would do it. And why was the industry not doing that? And the reason is, if you want to make a monomaterial, it ends up being a lot thicker and more expensive, and you use more material. So going mono sounds great to the layperson, but it's not necessarily green every time, right? If you've got a film that's half the thickness and it's a bilayer and it's able to do its job at half the thickness and using half the material and half the energy, then that may end up being greener than the mono material, because you have to use so much more of it to get the barrier properties and all of the rest of it that you're looking for. So this is not as, and the other thing to think about is that many of these bi and tri layers are easy to recycle. You just add a bit of compatibilizer. These are commercially available. They've been used for decades. You add a bit of compatibilizer that makes everything, you know, basically reprocess well, and you're fine. So I think there is a place for monomaterials, but it's not the panacea the layperson would think of, because these bi and tri and even 6-layer structures are there for a reason, because they do a better job with less material used.
A comment here on the oceanic gyres in terms of the quantification of the particles by numbers. The comment here is that you're quantifying them by low weight volume when they've already photodegraded to micro and nano sized particles. I know you did address that, Chris, but you want to comment again or point to the area in the book where your work suggests that that comment?
Well, you can count it how you want. If you want a bigger number, you can go for smaller particles. I mean, things get smaller and smaller and the numbers go up. So what can I say? There are studies that look at each size and how much of them there is. And if people want to look at it by weight or volume or number, that's okay. I mean, what I'd be worried about is somebody says, look, I see 1 million particles. And then you say, well, that the total weight of those particles is 0.0001 grams, right? Now, how scary does it look? There's hardly anything there. So you have to think about both things at the same time.
And can you comment on PE coated paper and the misconceptions around it?
Not in detail. What I do find strange is you'll see these posts on LinkedIn, for example, look, we made a paper bottle, and then somebody will point out, well, inside your paper bottle is a plastic bottle that you've hidden with the paper, right? Because plastic, is a barrier to water and paper isn't. So it's the same with a lot of these laminated cardboard, right? Paper is just not good at containing liquids. You need a layer of plastic there. And from what I understand, they can be recycled in some cases together, in some cases they can't. I think it's rather difficult to do, and people are looking, the latest I heard, people are looking for solutions to have coatings for the paper, which can be recycled more easily than the plastic is. But I'm not an expert on that, and I wouldn't like to really comment in detail.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is a fair point as well. There's some of the other questions that are coming in here, some perhaps more narrowly focused on the science, which is great because we should have those conversations within and without SPE as well. Just one or two more then, Chris. A few people have posted some helpful links here as well, including the titles of the books that have been referenced. A lot of people are asking for links to access the book as well as the presentation. And again, those will all be available. Deb or Sue, if you want to comment on how those are going to be made available to people, I think that would put a few minds at ease.
Yes, basically, everybody who registered for the event will be sent an email. It will have a link to the video And we'll also have a link to the book online that you can read, as well as a link to the presentation. And we'll also have the information in the SPE library.
Very good. One last comment then, Chris, because this does not get a lot of attention as well, because a lot of us are focused on packaging. But what about other thermosets? Have you considered any of that as part of your research, or have you only focused on thermoplastics?
My career as a scientist has been almost exclusively on thermoplastics. So I did see the thermosets. Of course, I know what they are as a polymer scientist, but they're a rather small part of the overall market. So I haven't really looked into them separately. And what I do know is that you can take a thermoset, grind it up, and use it as a filler for a thermoplastic. So there are proven ways of dealing with thermosets, but I haven't done a deep dive into thermosets and how they would be different.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, unfortunately, the questions just keep coming in here, and some of them are similar to what has been answered. We really could be here all day. This is a great, rich topic. I would encourage everybody who is on here and who are part of SPE to join us on some of our online conversations in the chain. For those of you who are not SPE members, I would encourage you to join if you want to continue this, because the wealth of knowledge among the scientists and polymer engineers, processing engineers among our ranks makes this a very rich and deep conversation. Frankly, I think we have to be comfortable with some ambiguity here. Not everything is going to be black and white in this discussion, but the amount of data that is being generated by Chris and others now are bringing a little bit more objectivity to this and allowing people then to make informed policy decisions as well. So with that, if there's no other housekeeping, Chris, thank you very much for your time.
There is a list at the back of this presentation which answers some common questions you may get from your customers. Will there be more plastic than fish in the ocean? And do plastics use a large amount of oil? And are there this many straws? So I've made a list here at the back of the presentation, so you'll find that slide. Because we need these one-liners, right? As you said, Connor, when somebody asks us as the plastics industry, if family, friends, or customers ask us, we have to know the answers to these things that come up all the time and just debunk this stuff, because there's been 10 years of misinformation. It's time for some facts to get out to the people so they can hopefully change their minds. Very good. Okay. Thanks, well, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks to SP for hosting this. And we will do our best to respond to the rest of the questions and make it available.
Terrific. Thanks.